So we've seen protests and sometimes violence and riots and arson, but we've also seen a lot of outpouring of support for minority communities that have long had dangerous confrontation with police. Yesterday, President Trump announced he'll be sending federal troops from various federal departments to cities across the United States in response to the ongoing protests, which have sometimes been followed with violence and arson. This expands the problematic and controversial federal efforts that have been ongoing in the city of Portland. And so against this somber backdrop, I'm honored to present to you our forum with just some amazing panelists to discuss this incredibly important and timely issue. But before doing the formal introductions, I do want to let you know how the next hour will unfold. We'll spend 45 minutes going through the panelists. I'll have some questions for them. They'll explain their role in our communities and governments and regarding the policing issue and issues of racial injustice more broadly. The last 15 minutes will be reserved for audience questions. Due to the nature of the virtual forum, the way that will work is that you can submit questions through the chat function. They'll only go to me, just so there's not an incredible array of conversation questions. I'll do my best to distill those questions and submit them to the panelists. Our hope is by doing it this way, we can get as many questions asked and answered as possible. And it's really just the best way, I think, to work within this Zoom environment. So now to the panelists. I want to go through them briefly in alphabetical order. We have Marc Bennett, who is the District Attorney of Sedgwick County, Kansas, home of Wichita, which is celebrating its 150th birthday today. So happy birthday, Wichita. He is a former president of the Kansas County and District Attorneys Association and was named Kansas Prosecutor of the Year by that organization in 2018. Lauren Bonds is the legal director of the ACLU of Kansas. Prior to joining the ACLU, Bonds served as the assistant general counsel at the Service Employees International Union, where she provided legal support for the union's Fight for $15 campaign. Melody Brannon is the federal public defender for the District of Kansas. She has been with the federal defender's office for 22 years, where she developed a holistic defense initiative. She also teaches at the National Criminal Defense College and Federal Trial Skills Academy. Quinton Lucas, known as Mayor Q, was sworn as the mayor of the other Kansas City in 2019. As mayor, he has prioritized making Kansas City's neighborhoods safer, creating more accessible and affordable housing and public transportation, fostering a healthy community, and improving basic services. Ursula Minor is a lifelong Lawrence resident who has been involved with the Lawrence branch of the NAACP for over 26 years and has been the president for that branch for 10 years. Under Minor's leadership, the Lawrence branch of the NAACP has pushed the city of Lawrence to employ the use of body cams, collect data by race and ethnicity on all police stops, and clarify the police complaint form, among other initiatives. Katina Taylor is the founder of Dreams KC and co-founder of Elements of Education KC. She's an edpreneur, which I have difficulty pronouncing, working to connect, inspire, support, and honor amazing African-American women in the field of education. So this is just a brief introduction of who our 6 panelists and stakeholders are in this discussion today. So to start off, I'm going to go through each panelist one by one, ask them a question that gives some information about their role in addressing issues of policing reform and racial injustice. And so even though it's always been a detriment to me, I'll go through the panelists in alphabetical order. So I'll start off with Marc Bennett. So Marc, hopefully, I haven't actually seen his video pop up yet today. Can you tell us about how your office handles claims of police misconduct and discriminatory enforcement? Because a prosecutor has sort of a role of both having to work with police in a cooperative manner, but sometimes in an adversarial way. And I wonder if you could give us some information about that process and tell us a little bit about, how you proceed in police cases.
Sure. First of all, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
So the first answer to your question is we have certain obligations under Supreme Court case law. Brady's the case that really everything flows from, and then other cases, Strickler versus Green, Giglio, and others that require us to not only, well, the first order of business, we have to share anything that we uncover that might be an impeachable situation with any witness, whether it's a cop or somebody else, but to share that information with the defense at the time we're going to charge a case. And so in order to make sure that we have information about every police officer, it's a little harder in a city the size of Wichita. If you work in a much smaller jurisdiction, county attorneys might literally know every cop in town. Sheriff's departments, police department, we've got 5 or 6 guys in a department and another 20 in the sheriff's department. It wouldn't be uncommon for some smaller county where the elected county attorney literally knows everybody. But there's over 400 police officers on the street in Wichita, and I certainly don't know the vast majority of them by name. So what we do is meet monthly. I personally meet monthly with the police department to go over every active, what they call IA investigation, so an internal affairs investigation. I want to know every officer who's been alleged by anyone, whether it's whatever the situation may be. So whether it's a use of force, and sometimes that includes an officer who had to shoot a deer that was hit by a motorist. Still, they discharged their weapon, so obviously that's not something I'm all concerned about. But every allegation of racial, ethnic, any sort of discrimination. Obviously, the one that comes to mind most often is going to be allegations of use of force or inappropriate interaction with a citizen. Someone was rude. Somebody was everything from rude behavior all the way up to putting their hands on somebody. And so we review those. I want to know what the status of the investigation is, and it may be end of the investigation, it becomes clear that there was a policy violation. And if there is, then I have to put in our records management system an attribute next to that officer's name, so that in the event that the officer retains his or her position, as I don't have the power to fire law enforcement officers, but if they are removed and they may be a witness down the road, I have a form that goes out automatically anytime one of those officers is endorsed as. Whether we ever call them or not is an entirely different matter, but we have to let the defense attorneys know anytime there's somebody with that kind of a situation that has the potential to offer impeachable information about that officer. So that's, I know we're trying to keep this short, a couple minutes apiece. That's the monthly effort we make to obtain this information and share the same with the defense bar in Wichita.
Thank you. That does help. Oops, I apologize. We have a visiting dog. If you hear a dog barking in the background, I can't control animals, so I apologize to everyone in advance. But my kids will be quiet. So let's move now to Lauren Bond. Lauren from the ACLU. The ACLU is an entity which I think is often maligned and misunderstood by many people in the public, but its mission is so broad and can cover so many different issues and litigation. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about any current efforts your office in Kansas has taken regarding policing, or things that you're contemplating in response to. Lauren, if you can give us a little information there, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. And good morning to everyone. Really, the ACLU's role, I think, in policing in Kansas in particular, is one of holding law enforcement and law enforcement agencies accountable. And so we do this in a couple ways, Professor Young. As you mentioned, litigation is kind of our primary method of advocacy. And so, we have 2 active cases related to police profiling right now. One is against the state police force, the Kansas Highway Patrol, for using, as we're alleging, an unlawful practice of detaining motorists for dog sniffs without reasonable suspicion. And the other case that we currently have is one about campus policing that we brought on behalf of some African-American student athletes at Highland Community College who have been subject to discriminatory and disparate dorm searches and scrutiny by the campus police. And so that's traditionally how we try to hold law enforcement agencies and officers accountable is through litigation. I think there's a lot of barriers to accountability when you're going the civil rights route. I'm sure all of you guys have already learned about qualified immunity and how that presents so many issues for holding individual officers accountable. And then obviously there's other Section 1983 barriers when you're trying to hold the agency accountable. I would uplift that we also have attempted to file administrative complaints in the past. Under Kansas law, the Attorney General has authority to investigate racially biased policing complaints, and those haven't went super well. There's been 165 filed in the last 6 years. 0 have been sustained. So I think there are some doubts that we have about the efficacy of administrative complaints, but that doesn't mean we're not going to keep trying. And then our organization, in addition to doing litigation, also does policy advocacy. And so we're trying to push electeds to hold law enforcement accountable as well. And that's through, possible legislation. And also, I think, to Professor Yung, to your point about what we're thinking about in the future, our executive branch has a ton of authority and discretion in this space. Not only do they effectively command the highway patrol and the state police, they also have a lot of authority over CPOST, which is the officer certification agency for all police officers in Kansas. And so we're looking for ways that we can work with the current governor and her administration to make improvements on policing.
Well, thank you. Let's move to Melody Brannon now. Melody is from the Federal Public Defender's Office. And I think it's fair to say, if you want to know about complaints of police violence, the best person to ask might be a public defender. His clients will regularly tell them a lot of stories. But you might have a little less of that at the federal level, but I'm guessing you bring a different perspective to the topic than many of our other panelists. So can you tell us about how, as a criminal defense lawyer, in particular a public defender, approaches the topic of police violence?
Certainly, and thank you. Yeah, you're correct. We see clients every day who have been brought into the system by arrests and prosecutions. And what we do on a case-by-case basis is to look at how our client came into the system, and from the courtroom, from inside the courtroom, sort of challenge police practices, misconduct, charging practices. We can look at all of those and through a prism to determine whether there was any sort of bias that influenced those decisions and be able to challenge them there. From a broader perspective, though, we're able to look at the system, and because we are public defense and we have a volume practice, we can detect different patterns of misconduct. Because we do our own data collection and investigation, we're able to identify problems systemically that we want to challenge and to litigate. It's sort of a corollary to what Lauren does at the ACLU. As a federal defender, we certainly see the federal agencies, but many of our cases originate from local law enforcement. And so we get to see the sheriff's offices and the local police departments and how they work with the federal agencies and how that case came to federal court. So we have a really, I think, a much broader perspective. That sort of overarching view of the entire system and systemic problems, I think, is where an established and public defender's office can really make a difference. We also play a role in outside the courtroom in policy. The opportunities we have to collaborate with law enforcement or with prosecution on systemic problems that we've identified, and an effort to sort of solve those problems or address those issues outside the system is really important. I believe that every time that Marc Bennett is sitting at a table, there ought to be a public defender next to him at these forums, at these commissions, because the public defender has a unique perspective and experience. I've been doing this for 30 years now, day in and day out, and because experience and because we need to give voice to our clients and their perspectives and experiences, it's important the public defender always has a seat at the policy table as well. And for that, I'm grateful for KU for inviting us to this.
Thank you. We're glad to have everyone here. So let's move now to Mayor Quinton Lucas. What's interesting about every panelist is they all counter and address these issues, not just from different perspectives, but also multifaceted ways. But I think a big city mayor can really use his position in so many different ways to address the issue. But I'm wondering if you know, just to pick on one particular aspect of that I think is often misunderstood, which is the relationship between a mayor and the police, which can vary from city to city. Because I think a lot of people in the public just assume as the head of the executive branch that you're the boss of the police. And it's usually not so simple. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your relationship, both formally, governmentally, and you know, as a pragmatic matter with the police department in addressing these sorts of issues.
Well, it is good to be with everyone. I'm a bit embarrassed because I'm the one with the least criminal law experience of everyone. So I look forward to learning from all of you today. It's also good to be back at a University of Kansas event where just a few years ago you could have caught me teaching a contracts course, which is very different than being a mayor during a pandemic, protests, and rising violent crime. To address Professor Young's question, I would probably note it this way. There are certainly lots of different government forms. Kansas City, Missouri is a bit unique in our relationship with the police department, but in a general sense, you are absolutely right. Even in cities where the mayor can hire and fire the police chief at his or her own election, it is much more difficult to change an institution on a day in and day out basis than you might think. Some of that is the institution itself. Some of it is administrative rules. Much of it is the fact that pragmatically and politically, you do want buy-in from your police departments. And often it will relate to the fact that your jurisdiction is often bound by contracts, labor negotiations, union contracts, that really do limit to some great extent that which you can do. Two stories briefly, and then I'll let us get back to questions. One relates to the fact that just yesterday I actually had a conversation with Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago. We deal with a number of similar issues, although her city is 6 times as large. And so she gets to deal with them first in most situations. And when we were talking about something that a lot of us mayors are dealing with right now, I haven't looked at statistics out of Wichita lately. I do know that some of the cities nearer to us, Topeka, for example, and then Springfield in Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, certainly, have also had an increase in non-fatal shootings, homicides, ours in Kansas City, Missouri being fairly significant, a 40% increase. Across the line in Kansas City, Kansas, we've seen a significant increase. How do we address those issues where typically the answer from local governments has always been more police officers with kind of political push, apolitical push that says defund the police or reallocate policing? It's my position that I'm not a defunder or an abolish the police person, but I do believe that we need enhanced allocation to certain resources, including mental health triage centers is what we call them in Kansas City, which is a place where we would usually take folks who are in a mental health crisis and not take them to the county jail or to the emergency room, where in both situations, usually people are coming right back out in a set of hours. Another area that we've seen some enhanced investment is in witness protection, witness relocation funding, and working with the police department to try to make sure we're addressing those issues. But fundamentally, what's the great challenge? Well, fundamentally, the great challenge is that police budgets have increased year over year in almost every American city without any level of cessation. And we have gotten very used to that being the answer to all things and all issues. An additional challenge for those of us in some major cities is that usually when the federal government is offering support, it is in a situation of more police officers or federal agents or federal authorities. Indeed, you might have seen they've announced such programs both in Kansas City and Chicago, I believe recently, as somewhat distinct from what you've seen in Portland in recent days. We're not just getting a flood of Homeland Security officials, but still a number of folks that we're trying to see what that relationship will be. How do you change things in the middle? How do you get people to know or to realize that perhaps more boots on the ground alone isn't the key to greater clearance rates for you? How do you get folks to realize that more, frankly, tools of enforcement aren't necessarily all that you need to solve crimes and to prevent crime? And frankly, moving to a prevention, intervention, and then only third enforcement type of approach to fighting crime in our city is something we're trying to get people to buy into. I will note that the police department really likes the last part of that, the enforcement side, prevention and intervention being the greatest challenge. And I know something that we will all be interested in talking about as time goes on.
All right, well, thank you. Very, very informative about how cities have, complicated political environments to address these issues. I want to turn now to Ursula Minor. She is our representative here from the local branch of the NAACP. The NAACP has probably been the most important organization throughout history in fighting police abuse of minorities. It's been a part of its mission since its inception. I mentioned some of your efforts in that front in my introduction, but can you tell us a little bit about what the NAACP, either here in Lawrence or maybe Kansas generally, is doing about police brutality at this moment? What are the sort of key things on your radar?
Hello. Right now, what the NAACP is working on is we got direction down from national, which actually comes to the state, down to us. And some of the things that we're working on currently is we recently, as a branch in Lawrence, met with the city manager and the current chief of police. And we wanted more information on how they were doing with data collection. Lawrence is now collecting data collection by race and ethnicity on all stops, which is something they hadn't done up until recently. So we wanted to know how the officers were working with that. Are they having a problem with it? The only problem they said they basically had is just more work and more information that they have to record. But you need that information. If you don't have data to back up what you're saying, then it doesn't do any good. So we needed to know if, African Americans or other minorities were being stopped for, reasons that weren't being recorded, or the simple things like that. So we also had requested the ban on knee holds and we looked at their use of force continuum, and that was a request down from national to all branches to look into that. And they have I don't want to go deep into what they have in place, but we did discuss use of force. And also we discussed body cameras. Body cameras are also fairly new to Lawrence, so we wanted to know how the officers were doing with body cams, how they work, when they're on, when they're off. We also found out something we didn't know. A citizen is, they can request to see their body cam film. At a request, you call a number and you can go see it. So part of our mission is to also educate people on, I'm sure a lot of people don't know that they could actually request body cam footage to see what happened if they had an interaction with an officer. We also met because we know that there's a lot of protests going on. Lawrence had some protests, and we wanted to know what the officers had in place if the protests had got out of hand or escalated, if white supremacists came into town, and or already in town, which we recently found out that we do have a lot of white supremacists in Lawrence. So what they hadn't planned to mitigate anything that maybe got out of hand. So we discussed that. We talked about the Citizens Review Board. We have a Citizens Review Board. We want to make sure that they have enough power, that they can review the cases openly. So we are actually working on that right now to see how much control they have, what they need to review cases and get things done. So I would say right now, that's what we're working on, and that's on the national and local level, the state level. That's what most of the branches are working on. So thank you.
Thank you. I forgot I muted myself.
Okay.
So I apologize there for the delay. So our last panelist, Katina Taylor, who focuses on education. So I imagine you bring a slightly, well, not just a slightly, very different perspective from our other panelists. but also one that focuses on very different moments in time. You know, a lot of our focus when we think of incidents of police violence, we fixate on immediate prevention or making people responsible. But education, I think, takes a different perspective, and it's one I identify a lot with as somebody who grew up in the DC area and lots of majority minority communities. I learned a very different perspective on policing than I think maybe somebody who grew up in Western Kansas or grew up in Wichita. So I wonder, Katina, if you could tell us a little bit about how you think education fits in the big picture of policing reform and racial injustice.
Yeah, and thank you so much for inviting me. Of course, I'm a proud alum of the KU Law School. So I was very excited to receive the invitation to participate. So as an educator, as a business owner, and as a community advocate, so I gave you a snippet in my bio of some of the things that I do. And being a native Kansas Citian, what I've had the opportunity to do is establish really amazing relationships and a very vast and broad network within the community that allows me to educate not only young people, but the adults, the seniors in our community around issues as it directly relates to policymaking and policing in our community. So my role really as a neighborhood leader and from a community-based advocate is that I have the opportunity to build relationships between all of those stakeholders. And so those that create policy, such as our city council members, our illustrious mayor who is here, of course, in the police directly, we have opportunities to have access to them and actually have some really tough and difficult conversations sometimes. I'll give you an example of that. Just last week, 2 members of the DA's office and quite a few members of the local police department joined me in a meeting at a local neighborhood office where we were able to engage in some really uncomfortable and difficult conversations, but we had to have those conversations in order to then talk about crafting and developing programs to really address root causes of violence in our communities. In addition to that, we spend time really understanding the roles of the stakeholders as it relates to police impropriety and the rising crime and violence in our community. So we are very clear about whose role it is to address police, or not police, but intervention and prevention. And that is not necessarily the role of the police. However, their role can change. They can pivot from responding to crime if the community and the rest of us as other stakeholders actually do our part and put programs and things in place to decrease the crime and violence, and they can then center around more engaging activities with the community. So that's really kind of my role that I've taken on in the place and space in which I occupy in this conversation. But I also understand that we have to not only address the root causes, understand the roles, but we also have to empower the community to actually address its own issues and not always look for those institutions and systems that we know cannot solve our problems. And so I'm a very staunch advocate for the community to take ownership of those things and then be given or provided the resources so that we can do the real work, boots on the ground. And we can't leave out and not mention that our larger role as all stakeholders in those tough conversations is to decenter white supremacist culture as it relates to people of color and people on the lower socioeconomic scale, and why we hold the biases that we hold. And so when we come into particular communities and neighborhoods, why we then act the way that we act as police officers. And so we have some of those tough conversations in hopes that we are shifting the mindset of those that do police work in our community.
Thank you. All right, so we got a good feel for who our panelists are, what they bring to the table, but I want to turn to the sort of big question that's confronting us all right now, which is what should we be doing about police violence and racial injustice? And importantly, what should our priorities be? Because it's easy to get overwhelmed with all the different avenues that this topic or this issue can be confronted. So I'm open to all the panelists. Feel free to jump in. I can play referee at times if needed, or if you want to raise your hand, I can make sure you get called on. But right now, I just want to open the floor to whoever wants to start and give us your thoughts. What should our big priority be, either from a policy perspective, a cultural perspective, however you want to tackle this issue?
I'll go ahead and jump in, Marc Bennett. I'll say this not just from the perspective of the district attorney, but also as the chair of the Criminal Justice Reform Commission for the state of Kansas. I can tell you what we're talking about and have been since for almost over a year now, so long before the current unrest. A couple of three things, big topics. Number one is mental health. Somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40% of the people in the penitentiary system in Kansas right now have been diagnosed with some degree of mental health. Now that could be episodic based upon depression for being incarcerated. I get that, but there's at least 11% of those folks who are, as they describe, persistently mentally ill. And so it just begs the question: what are people in that circumstance? Why are they in the criminal justice system? And part of the answer to that is we as a society, and Kansas is no different, and Kansas is frankly no worse than other states in this regard. All the states have frankly taken this position, this slow slide, but going back 20, 30, almost actually to the Kennedy administration when this began, but we just don't put resources into mental health the way we used to. In 1990, we had some in the neighborhood of, I want to get this right here, don't want to misspeak, I think we had 1,000 beds for overnight stays for mental health in Kansas, and tonight we have somewhere in the neighborhood about 215. And so so who responds to mental health? What do we do with people in mental health crisis? That's a topic that must be addressed societally, and I think the Reform Commission is taking that on. I know they are, in fact. Number two is traffic codes. There are so many ways you can get a traffic ticket, and I think the post audit of the Ferguson area and Ferguson City in particular, not the Michael Brown shooting specifically, but the post audit that took place with regard to just that community, traffic codes and the overemphasis of those by the local law enforcement was seen by the Obama's Justice Department's review as one of the prime drivers for the discord in that community. And it seems simple. I mean, there's drug infractions, not that big a deal. No one goes to prison for this. But at the same time, the bevy of traffic offenses that someone can be pulled over for and cited, and the costs that just increase and go up, and it gets harder and harder to get your license. But we live in Kansas, frankly. The subway system's not real robust in or Leavenworth or Wichita, for that matter. So if you don't have a set of wheels, you don't get to work. You don't get to your PO. You don't get so many other things that cascading consequences of that. And then the final thing that I think is important for people to remember is 911 calls are the main mechanism by which law enforcement, at least in urban areas, get called to a location. And so, again, it's hard not to get too granular here, but when cops are being called out to locations and then they look down and they've got three more stacked up behind it, they're showing up, dealing with the matter at hand, very short order, because they know they've got to get to the next call. I talked to a cop who joined the force in '62, I think. He was long since retired. Said back in those days, the cops would show up and they'd spend 30, 40 minutes at a scene, talk to people, figure out what was going on. Not to suggest that things were lovely back then, but it was a different environment from situations now where young officers are responding to a scene and they've literally got 2 and 3 other calls stacked up behind them. There's an urgency and there's a lack of time, and decisions are made even more in the moment, and even more fraught with issues when people are making under those kind of stresses. So those are big things. One final thing I'd point out, and then I'll back off, but domestic violence. I think that's a component that gets missed in this conversation. The number of homicides, the number of violent crime, because every major city, but most major cities in Wichita, and certainly no exception, is facing a situation with increasing violence. And what is going on? Why is that taking place? And one of the when you really do get granular and drill down, one of the things you see that permeates all of these violent crimes is a history of exposure to domestic violence. I think we as a society are just now starting to understand the lasting effects that being exposed to domestic violence as a child and as a young person, et cetera, has on on a person's ability to function, comply with the rules, be a contributor, a citizen who contributes to society. And we don't do anything, frankly, to help people in that regard. We hold them accountable when they do it and put them in jail and get out and maybe send them to a better offender program and hope for the best. But the final thing is we did just a quick snapshot of all the homicides that occurred in 2019. One of my staff just took an afternoon because she wanted to see if her supposition was correct. And literally of the 40 homicides that we had in Wichita that year, she looked back and found that I think all but one of the individuals, either the suspect or the person killed, had a history of domestic violence. Not even with each other necessarily, but at some point in their life, they had been exposed to, been the victim, or been a suspect of domestic violence. And it may seem off topic in the context of race and the policing, but when that is the driver to get people involved in the criminal justice system, if you want to have a better outcome on the back end, we need to be having, as the last speaker said, the tough conversations about what's causing these issues in our communities in the first place. So lots to go on, but I'm trying to keep it quick.
So I'd love to jump in, and I think that this is a very complex issue. But when we start thinking about police reform, police brutality, the way in which police show up in community, we have to have a real clear picture of what the conversation really is. So yes, I even said in my opening, root causes and things like that need to be addressed. But if we're actually talking about how the men and women in uniform who have taken an oath to protect and serve show up in communities of color, especially in poor communities, and then how they, for some reason, not all, but many, have a problem, a lack of skill set to de-escalate rather than escalate, which then leads to murder of residents that they should be protecting and serving, and getting them to the social work resources that they need so that they can find healing. That's a different conversation. So when I hear about mental health, when I hear about domestic violence, when I hear about traffic, that doesn't really go to the actual issue of how men and women in uniform show up in our communities and the biases that they bring with them, which causes them to see Black, brown people, Black, brown girls, in particular, because we don't often include Black women and brown women in this conversation, how they engage with them, how they adultify them or put upon them these labels, and they see them as less than human. We're not having that conversation. So when I think about mental health, I'm like, are we talking about the mental health of the police officers that show up in our communities to make sure that they're equipped to deal with the issues that they will be facing, so they're not operating from a place of fear, so that they attack first and ask questions later? Are we talking about that? Are we talking about the way in which we recruit and retain them? Are we looking at how they transfer from one department to another department when they've had a history of violence or inappropriate behavior as it relates to citizens? I think those are the priorities that we need to be thinking about. The role of unions, the fact that the police department oftentimes is tasked with investigating itself when an officer is accused of wrongdoing, and then they are the ones that are putting forth the probable cause statement to the DA. Does that really make sense? Those are the priorities I think we need to be talking about, and the policy changes that we need to be addressing so that we really are having the right conversation. We don't want to continue to victimize the people that have historically and systemically and institutionally been victimized through the institution of policing.
I think it's, let me just add one quick note, because I don't want to interfere, but the mental health piece does seem in some ways, not at the core of what a lot of people are concerned about. But I should point out, just for, outside of Kansas, Berkeley, California, just became the first jurisdiction to replace police in mental health calls. So they're trying to lower police encounters that sometimes escalate because the person who's involved is sometimes having delusions, is sometimes suicidal. And in fact, perhaps the deadliest police department in the country in terms of the rate per capita of use of lethal force killing civilians might be a surprise to you. It's Albuquerque, New Mexico. And one of the prime reasons is their encounters of people in mental health crisis. So it's not necessarily the core issue, but it does, fit into the big picture. And I think both Katina and Marc raised points, that about how it can fit into that. I know Quinton, Mayor Lucas, had his hand raised, so why don't I turn to him And I think, I know Melody, well, I'll try to get through everyone. It's basically, I know there's a lot of you, but why don't we start with Quinton?
Well, you know, I absolutely did want to talk about mental health and how we're actually treating long-term issues with people in mental health crisis. And I think that's been kind of our biggest, if I will say, mistake area and how we're looking to resolve certain community police issues. For example, here in Kansas City, very recently, we had a very tragic shooting of a Kansas City, Missouri police officer. He was struck in the head, injured critically. Police returned fire and killed the suspect. Once we actually dug into the suspect's history, you saw a long set of failures, both at the hands of our mental health system, largely our criminal justice system and beyond, that I think harmed both the gentleman and the officer. And what that related to was the fact that although the call came for somebody who was at a McDonald's, who was uttering any number of things that seemed incoherent, his pants were all the way down, there were a lot of indicia that there was something wrong, we still, don't actually always have our mental health resources, I think, ready enough to try to help intervene in that key step. And so something that I think needs to change, and frankly, a way that we can move the conversation forward isn't so much what is it that we take from a police department, but instead, how do we build up responsibilities for other agencies or agencies working in concert with police departments to respond to such situations? I think right now there is so much either or in America, and I believe it absolutely stems from the federal government and the White House, where it's kind of you're either all in on something or the other, instead of saying that, you know, darn it, and it's why I enjoy talking to a group of lawyers largely, or lawyers and friends. There are nuances to these things. There are ways that we want to be able to balance certain solutions. And I think that's how we could actually address some of our brutality concern. Another area I think of issue is in how we actually deal with de-escalation and true answers to de-escalation. My police department proudly actually said after, and Katina knows this probably better than I do. You know, they said after the protest or during the protest, oh, well, we already have answered a lot of these things that the protesters have issues with. We do not do chokeholds, for example. And I said, really? That's fascinating. Wow, exciting. And then they said, no, we do lateral neck restraints. And I'm like, oh, well, what does that look like? Well, you know, it's like this, but, you know, the pressure point is different. A choke, you know, and then a chokehold is if you do that poorly. And, you know, some of us who were talking about the relationship between mayors and police departments, a lot of the time, right, I'm not coming at people as a hater, right? I'm just trying to say, no, let me actually understand the difference. And then usually you get this quick, no, there's a big difference. And then you get some sort of, I think, distance from there. What we are trying to do, and what I know particularly more progressive mayors and leaders are trying to do, is to, I think, show police departments that there is a way where we can say, no, maybe we need a middle step, right? Maybe we need something more than warnings before tear gas. Maybe we need something more than you had some suspicions about a suspect and then you go to the lateral neck restraint. Because the challenge is that disproportionately, when you think someone is more dangerous, you will use those types of tools of fighting. And disproportionately, you will see the suspect who is Black, right? The suspect who might be younger, right? As someone who creates that type of threat in a way that you aren't seeing the, let's say, white female young suspect in the same way. And so that's an ongoing, I think, discussion we have. A lot of it's requiring not just police, but all of us, I think, to recognize where our stereotypes are. I'm one who would have the same one, actually, right? If there was a white woman who's 20 walking down my street tomorrow in Kansas City at like 1 in the morning, depends, but I might not necessarily have some of the same responses that I might for somebody different. That's the implicit bias that I have even as a Black man in our country. And I think it's important for all of us to actually recognize that along the way, particularly those of us, those in law enforcement. You're muted, Corey.
Thank you. Thank you. The mayor has to tell me it's quite embarrassing. So Melody, I think you're up next. So why don't you, jump in now.
I will, and I'll follow on what Katina was saying, because I think our first priority ought to be to reject the ideas that have already failed. I think more police training, more policing, citizen review boards that don't have any power, those are failed ideas, and we need to move on from there and look at something bigger. My first priority is sure that there's an established and robust public defender in every community, but particularly communities that are the most poor and the most diverse, such as Wyandotte County, which does not have a state public defender. I think that one of the checks on police power and prosecutorial abuses is the existence of a public defender in that community and in that system. I hear a lot of calls for transparency, and we've talked a lot about data, and the data the NAACP is trying to collect, that sort of thing. And that's absolutely right. But the thing is, transparency doesn't mean anything if there hasn't been a meaningful and reliable collection of data in the first place. It's like unlocking a door to an empty room. It just doesn't advance what we're trying to do at all. So there has to be not just a requirement that the police keep track of the data, but there has to be a check on that, and there has to be a consequence for the failure to do it, a real consequence for the failure to do it. And maybe tie it to funding, or maybe have it accountable to a third party. But that data then has to be available to the public defender and public. I shouldn't have to go into court and beg for information or file motions or fight for the history of a particular police officer. That ought to be readily available to me. I shouldn't have to file FOIA requests to get information on police practices in my community. I ought to be able to call it up online. I shouldn't have to spend those resources to do that. The last thing I want to say, and if we're looking at sort of overall things, and especially mental health, we need to end post-prison supervision. When people are done with their prison sentence, they need to be done with it. If we are serious about reentry, and so we have post-prison supervision as an idea of this is how we're going to help people transition and reenter to the community. If we're serious about that, we ought to provide reentry services without the threat of re-imprisonment, because so much policing is spent on people who are just out of prison, because the police have a lot more power over the people who are right out of prison because they're on supervision. And these are disproportionately people of color. We need to end that practice. It's become an entire industry. A lot of my time is spent dealing with people who are rearrested after this. And you know, the thing is, they're not being sent back to prison because of new crimes. They're being sent back to prison because of addiction, and very often because of mental health problems, because we have not provided treatment or mental health services for the people who need it. And we are very morally short-sighted, but also it's economically just absurd to think that we're going to re-imprison people who are addicted or have mental health problems rather than addressing the underlying problem. And that's something that I think should be a priority going forward.
Yeah, I think, and I mean, I'm very happy to hear everyone calling for greater data because I study criminal law from an empirical database perspective, and it is amazing how poor our data is in the United States. I can get far more information about other nations' policing than I can my own, and that's just a mistake from the inception of the way our police departments were created and how they gather information. So I wanted to give a chance to either Lauren or Ursula if you wanted to chime in here. Message to the audience, I'm starting to get some questions, but feel free to send those questions to me now through the chat function, and I will make sure to get them to our panelists as appropriate. So yeah, Lauren or Ursula, do you want to chime in?
Sure. And I mean, basically everything Melody and Katina said, but, you know, I would also, you know, uplift it as part of this transparency question. And we've heard it here today, you know, people who are in active federal court cases don't have access to this information. Mayor Lucas, who is these people's boss, does not have access to this information. So thinking that members of the public or advocacy organizations like the ACLU would have access to this information is kind of beyond a reasonable expectation at this point. But I really do think that that is the baseline for so much of this reform conversation. Like people, I think there isn't even, you know, preliminary knowledge about the problems here and the racial disparities here because of the lack of transparency. But also to Melody's point, there's got to be accountability for lack of transparency as well, and accountability for when we find out what is actually going on when there is transparency. And, you know, I think coming at this from, you know, a civil litigator's perspective, I started out by talking about those barriers to civil remedies for people who have their civil rights abused by law enforcement. Qualified immunity right there. I think that is an area where I think all these, you know, young attorneys on the call and legal scholars on the call, that's something that I think there's a real opportunity for courts to look at again. And, you know, in addition to that, I think on the other side of it, if you're not able to get relief in civil court through a lawsuit, particularly in law enforcement or officer involved shootings, there's kind of this other side where, you know, if you kill somebody, a prosecutor should be able to prosecute them. And Mr. Mark, I don't know if you've, you know, encountered these problems in the past with officer involved shootings. I'm thinking of the Marquez Smart case in Wichita. You know, I think his family really was caught between these two barriers, right? I mean, the barriers that prosecutors have in prosecuting law enforcement when they do murder someone, and then the barriers that the estate of a family face when they go to court. You know, Mr. Smart's family, they lost in the district court on a qualified immunity issue when they were trying to hold individual officers accountable. Luckily, the 10th Circuit reversed some of those findings, and they're back in district court, but there's really no recourse when your family member is murdered because of how our system is set up. And so I'm thinking, you know, that's so important. And if it can't be, you know, prosecutors filing criminal charges, if it can't be a route in civil court through civil rights litigation, there's got to be some kind of state administrative body who can, you know, effectively investigate and create consequences for officers who murder people or hurt them or harm them. And we don't have that in Kansas. And I think that, you know, that's why reform of CPOST, that training and certification agency could be so effective, or having the Attorney General's office, you know, actually have teeth to their racial profiling investigative powers. I think that would go such a long way. And so I think there just can't be so many limits to accountability and so many limits to remedies. And that's, I think, a good way to start, because if you can do these things and there are no consequences, nothing's going to change.
I'm sorry, I actually muted myself. I'm trying to unmute myself. I will get a hang of this. You know, I was on sabbatical last year. I didn't learn Zoom the way everyone else did. Yeah, I mean, I think that people don't realize how little accountability there is for police in the United States compared to similar nations. Qualified immunity was a doctrine invented by the courts to protect police. It's a unique creature, and there's been a lot of bipartisan efforts now to fight against it, because it's such an unusual doctrine that really makes for little accountability in the civil rights litigation realm. But in general, I want to return to something Melody said earlier, civilian review boards. In some jurisdictions, they've proven to be quite effective, but as she mentioned, it's with power, right? You know, it's certain civilian review boards are given the power to issue more than just findings and recommendations, but to actually change whether or not somebody continues to be employed with the police. There's a lot of accountability issues across the board that I think are important. We are running a little late. I do want to leave time for questions, but I also want to see if Ursula wanted to add anything before going to the questions.
Am I on? Hello. Okay.
Hi.
I'd like to say I agree with Melody, Lauren, and Katina, but as far as data collection, the reason I'd like to say in Lawrence we started data collection, because from a former police chief, we had a meeting with him several times, and one thing that he said that struck me was that Lawrence doesn't have any problems. I don't see anything wrong. I don't, you know, we haven't heard anything from minorities, so there's not a problem. And on the flip side, we had been hearing a lot from the minority population as far as being pulled over from the police, not given a ticket, headlights are out, you had the wrong tag on, your sticker wasn't on, all kinds of reasons they were pulled over. But at that point, they were not documenting those stops because a ticket wasn't given. So we requested everything, all stops, be recorded by race and ethnicity, so that we could prove that there was a lot of stops to a lot of minorities, which leads to other things going to jail. Lawrence, Douglas County has a high rate of minorities in our jail system right now, higher than the population of minorities in Lawrence. So I would say as far as data collection, it's a needed thing, but I also agree it's what you do with it. We are working with the CJCC, our Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, to work with the data, make the data public so anybody can see it. There's a lot of, there's judges, the DA, the mayor, different people on this Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. I would say that as a community, as an NAACP, because it takes the community to also put a lot of these things in place, you have to make sure that there's policy on the data. Even as far as body cams won't solve everything, but I believe that they are much needed. In a lot of cases, it does help. Sometimes it doesn't, but you have to be the one that pushes the policy behind a lot of these things to make sure that they work, that there's actions behind them to keep everything in check. I would say it's the same thing for citizens review boards. We have a citizens review board right now that does not have much power, but we are working on that, trying to push that they do gain some kind of power and, have a better citizens review board. We just recently had an article in the paper about the citizens review board hasn't actually received very many complaints at all. But then when we go to the website, the police website, it doesn't mention the Citizens Review Board, so you get very deep into the site to find out that it even exists. The forms are very hard to fill out. They're not very user-friendly to people, and a lot of the questions are vague and not very user-friendly to minorities. So I would say that it's up to us as NAACP and forming partnerships and things like that in the community to make sure that things are in place to make sure that all these things work and that the programming works.
All right, well, thank you. Interestingly, as I'm going through the questions here from the audience, all but one of the questions focus on an issue or focus on activism. In other words, the students and former students I see are asking, what do you think they can be doing first to help get rid of qualified immunity and other areas where police are not held accountable? Someone else is asking about how can they advocate for public defenders' offices in two of our biggest counties not having them. And someone else cites and mentions Brian Stevenson and the inherent arbitrariness and geographic and racial biases in the death penalty and in our justice system generally. And so I wonder if any of the panelists want to talk about, not necessarily in the courtroom or in the legislature or the executive, but what do you think these young lawyers or soon-to-be lawyers can do to help these issues that they seem to recognize are very important?
I'm just going to make Katina talk because I think she's been doing it.
So I would, these are great questions. So I would, 1, register to vote and vote. 2, put pressure on local and state officials. Work with, one of the things that I have seen is that so many organizations, some of the traditionally older organizations that exist in communities, and then some of the newer ones are having a very difficult time generationally coming together and collectively collaborating to put forth policy and then move those agendas forward. But this is only going to work. We're only going to get traction if we do that work. And that also means that predominantly African-American organizations and neighborhoods and communities and students have to work with our Brown communities, our Indigenous people as well. When I think about Lawrence and living there, there is a large Indigenous population, like, Native American population and things like that. So we have to work collectively and collaboratively to actually draft policy, then push it forward, and then find champions at the local and state level to make these policy changes that we want. We have to make money contributions to move these agendas and policy changes forward. It takes dollars and cents. It takes time, and it takes that human capital. So, register to vote, work with, guide, educate others again on how to craft policy, and then be the middleman. And oftentimes it's difficult to bring those competing organizations together. But what I have found and what I have said sitting in some of those rooms is, look, it's not about you and I. We can go back to our corners and disagree and not like each other tomorrow. But today we have a common interest that we need to move forward for the sake of my grandchildren, your grandchildren, or whomever it may be, our communities and our neighborhoods. And that's what's important. So if we're willing to put some of those personal things aside and some of our philosophical differences aside and our positions and our titles, then we can do real work. And so I think that students, having just not necessarily been jaded yet, they have a unique opportunity to really be leaders in this movement and in this work. And, you know, they don't always have to ask permission either. And I think oftentimes young people think that they have to ask permission. I think you be respectful and you gain the wisdom from those older individuals that have been in the fight for quite some time. But sometimes you take the bull by the horn and you say, come on, let's go together. I'll help you along the way. And I want you to help me along the way in the areas that I am not shored up in. And I think that will move the agenda forward.
Corey, I'll jump in here. I think Marc Bennett will agree with me that good prosecutors want good public defenders and want to deal with good defense lawyers. So the people are asking questions about how do we get a public defender office in those counties that need it the most. Look at the DA's races that are running right there. Go ask those candidates, do you support a public defender office in that county? And get them to commit to supporting a good, strong public defender. Not only a public defender, but being willing to back the resources and funding that public defender's office need. So yeah, I think absolutely start with voting and vote for the prosecutor that's willing to support that.
I'll just say,
Okay,
oh, sorry, prosecutor, you got it.
I'll just say, yeah, one thing I'd say was to law students in particular, as opposed to undergrads, because as law students, you're in a position to do this obviously much more quickly. But if you're in a community that doesn't have a public defender system, then I'd agree with Melody. You need to make sure that not only the local DA supports it, but that also was going to take some legislative or at the very least, that's going to take some legislation as well. But the big picture is go join a DA's office, county attorney's office, or a public defender's office. If you want to make an impact in the criminal justice system, we need good people. And the truth is it's tough work and you're not going to make as much money. And every decision you make from a prosecutor or a public defender, it's going to be questioned by somebody later. In Kansas, you get a 1507, which is an ineffective assistance of counsel claim against you for the defense that turn in. Everything that the prosecutors do gets questioned. That's how the system works. And it's difficult and it's ugly work sometimes, but don't be afraid to join. We need good prosecutors, good public defenders. And if you're in a community that doesn't do public defender work, then I'd suggest, if you don't want to make Wyandotte County your home, for instance, then go work in Johnson or Shawnee County for a few years, cut your teeth in the public defender system, then go back and open your own shop, because at least be a private defense attorney. We need good people involved in the system.
So if I can jump in with career advice.
Yeah, I appreciate everyone staying over time. This is great. We do have to wind down here, but I want to give Lauren and then Quinton just quick closing thoughts because I think this has been great. And I'll just close out with my thoughts here. I hope for everyone in the audience, one of the goals today was to bring a lot of different perspectives to the issues that don't just replicate what you read in the media, and especially to a legal audience. And I really appreciate the incredible breadth of issues that people have brought to bear and approaches, and I hope it's been a benefit to you and the audience. So I'm going to let Lauren and Mayor Lucas close us out, but thank you all for coming and staying a little late today.
Yeah, I would just say thank you guys all for having us. And if you're really interested in how you can support the activism that's happening right now or be an activist yourself, there are fantastic courses on how to be a movement lawyer out there. Go to Law for Black Lives. Just Google that. There are incredible resources where you can think about different ways that you can currently use your legal training to help the movement, but also to think about what you want to do with your career long term. And if you want to, approach this from a civil rights kind of direction, find my email, email me. I love to talk about this stuff. I'm more than available. Yeah, thank you guys so much for joining. And I'm really excited that so many of you are interested in ways to make things better right now.
I'll just.
And I'm gonna go and before Quinton here, Karen Brett, who will be teaching at KU this year, a course on sort of social justice activism, lawyering. So if you're interested, you're still a student, that's certainly something you should look into. Okay, now to Mayor Lucas.
Thank you so much. I would just say very succinctly, know that you can make a bigger difference than you would think from your first day out in the world as an activist or a lawyer, anything of the sort. Right now we have a protest movement, a significant one in Kansas City where a number of different organizations are involved. You don't have to run any organization, frankly, just showing up. All of our cities, Kansas's largest, Wichita, our largest counties, Missouri's largest city, Kansas City, actually are still pretty small at the end of the day, such that you have an opportunity to get to know people fairly quickly, be involved, be engaged. And so I'd encourage you to do things like get Lauren's email or anyone's and just start learning and start making your voice heard along the way.
Well, thank you, everyone. This concludes, I think, a very incredible forum, and hopefully, gives you a lot to think about, because, for those of you who've had me as a teacher, know I think everyone should go into criminal justice. But policing and these issues, they're just right on the front burner of politics and our culture and society today. And I think the panelists have done a great job giving us information, particularly in Kansas, that we can use. So thank you all, and for taking time out of your day. Hope I'll see you all in the future.